I never thought a forgotten ride home would be the moment that changed everything. But sometimes life has a way of forcing revelations when you least expect them. The rain was coming down in sheets that Tuesday evening, and I stood under the narrow awning of Bella Vista watching my phone screen light up with another unanswered call to my husband David. 20 minutes late and counting, with no response to my text asking where he was. What happened next didn't just embarrass him in front of a room full of strangers, it shattered the carefully constructed illusion our entire marriage had been built on. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The evening had started like so many others over the past 3 years, with David dropping me off at Bella Vista for what he believed was my part-time hostess job. I had been working there since we moved to Portland, or at least that's what I had told him. The truth was far more complicated, but David had never shown enough interest in the details of my work life to discover what I was really doing with my days. He would pull up to the curb, barely glancing at the restaurant's elegant exterior, and mutter something about picking me up at closing time before driving off to whatever social engagement he had planned with his friends. David worked in tech sales, a job that provided us with a comfortable lifestyle in our downtown apartment and funded his expensive hobbies like golf and craft beer collecting. He had a way of talking about money that made it clear he saw himself as the provider in our relationship, the one whose career mattered, whose income was essential. My job at the restaurant was something he tolerated rather than respected, a way for me to stay busy and contribute a little extra spending money while he focused on what he considered the serious business of building our future. That Tuesday evening, I had closed the restaurant later than usual after a particularly busy dinner service. We had hosted a private event for a local law firm, and the coordination had required my personal attention well into the evening. By the time I locked the front doors and set the security system, it was nearly 10:30, much later than my usual 9 o'clock finish. I had texted David around 9 to let him know I would need another hour, and he had responded with a thumbs up emoji, his typical level of engagement with anything related to my work. Standing under that awning, watching the rain turn the street into a river of reflected neon lights, I felt the familiar weight of being an afterthought in my own marriage. David's friends knew him as the successful salesman with the ambitious quarterly targets and the impressive client roster. I was simply his wife, the woman who worked at some restaurant downtown. Pleasant enough, but not particularly interesting. At dinner parties, conversations would flow around me as if I were part of the furniture. David answering questions about my job with vague responses that made it clear he had never really listened to my explanations about what I did. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stood there in the rain, waiting for a man who saw me as dependent on him while I held the keys to a business he couldn't begin to comprehend. Bella Vista wasn't just where I worked, it was my creation. My vision brought to life through years of careful planning, strategic investment, and relentless dedication. But David lived in a world where women like me supported men like him, where my role was to be grateful for his provision and understanding of his priorities. He had never asked probing questions about my income from the restaurant, never wondered why I sometimes came home energized rather than exhausted, never noticed the way other restaurant owners in the city treated me with professional respect when we encountered them at social events. The rain continued to fall as I scrolled through our text conversation, noting the increasing desperation in my messages. "Where are you? Running late. Can you call me? David, I'm still waiting." The read receipts showed he had seen each message, but apparently responding wasn't a priority. This wasn't entirely unusual behavior for him. David had a way of getting absorbed in whatever he was doing and losing track of time, especially when it involved his social circle. His friends were mostly other men in tech, guys who gathered at upscale bars to discuss quarterly projections and complain about their demanding schedules, while their wives managed the details of domestic life. I had met David 4 years ago at a networking event for young professionals. He had been charming and attentive, impressed by my background in business management and my plans to open my own restaurant. At that time, I had been working as a general manager for a restaurant group while secretly developing my business plan and searching for the right location. David had seemed supportive of my entrepreneurial ambitions, asking thoughtful questions about my timeline and offering to help with connections in the business community. But somewhere in the transition from dating to marriage, his enthusiasm for my career goals had transformed into a kind of benevolent tolerance. Once we were married and settled into our routine, David began to treat my restaurant work as a hobby rather than a serious business endeavor. When I tried to share details about challenging days or exciting developments, his attention would drift to his phone, or he would redirect the conversation to his own work challenges. Gradually, I stopped trying to include him in the daily reality of building and running a business. The shift had been so subtle that I hadn't fully recognized it until I was standing in the rain, feeling like a teenager waiting for a ride home from soccer practice. David had transformed me into a supporting character in our shared life story, the devoted wife whose modest job helped supplement the household income while he pursued the real career. He introduced me to his colleagues as someone who worked in food service, a description that was technically accurate but completely missed the scope of what I had built. By 11 o'clock, I was beyond frustrated and moving into genuine anger. The rain had intensified, turning the quiet street into a scene from a noir film. The few other businesses on the block had long since closed, leaving only the streetlights and the occasional passing car to break the darkness. I tried calling David one more time, listening to the phone ring endlessly before going to voicemail. His outgoing message, recorded in his confident sales voice, promised prompt responses to important calls. Apparently, his stranded wife didn't qualify. I was about to call a rideshare when I heard footsteps splashing through the puddles behind me. Turning, I saw Marcus Chen approaching with a large umbrella and a concerned expression. Marcus owned the wine bar 3 blocks down and had become a friend over the past year as we navigated the challenges of running independent restaurants in Portland's competitive food scene. He was one of the few people in my professional circle who knew both my real role at Bella Vista and my complicated marriage dynamics. "Emma, what are you doing standing out here in this weather?" Marcus called out, quickening his pace to reach. "Please tell me you're not waiting for David again." I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment, though the rain had already left me thoroughly soaked. Marcus had witnessed this scenario before, though never quite this dramatically. David's chronic lateness when it came to picking me up had become something of a running joke among my restaurant industry friends, though they were tactful enough not to comment directly. The fact that a successful restaurant owner was regularly stranded by her husband who saw her as having a service job was an irony that wasn't lost on anyone in our professional community. "He's running a little late," I said, attempting to maintain some dignity despite the obvious evidence to the contrary. "I'm sure he'll be here soon." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "Emma, you're soaked through and you look like you've been standing here for a while. Why don't you come wait in my car? I can drive you home, or at least somewhere dry while you figure out what's going on with David." The offer was tempting, but I found myself hesitating. Accepting a ride from Marcus would mean admitting that David had essentially abandoned me, and it would require explanations I wasn't sure I was ready to provide. Marcus knew about my marriage difficulties in general terms, but he didn't know the extent to which David dismissed and minimized my professional accomplishments. In the restaurant community, I was respected as an innovative owner who had turned Bella Vista into one of the city's most sought-after dining destinations. At home, I was David's wife who worked in food service. "I appreciate the offer," I said, checking my phone one more time for any sign of communication from David. "But I'm sure he just got caught up with something and lost track of time. You know how it is." Marcus studied my face in the streetlight, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. We had developed a friendship built on mutual respect. for each other's business acumen and shared experiences of the restaurant industry's challenges. He had never directly criticized David, but his questions about my marriage had become increasingly pointed over recent months. Marcus had a way of asking about David's involvement in Bella Vista that suggested he found the arrangement puzzling. "Emma," Marcus said gently, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't take it the wrong way. But does David actually know what you do here? I mean, really know?" The question hit me like a physical blow, not because it was unfair, but because it was so precisely on target. I had been living with the cognitive dissonance of my divided existence for so long that I had almost convinced myself it was normal. At Bella Vista, I was Emma Rodriguez, the owner and creative force behind one of Portland's most innovative restaurants. At home, I was Emma who worked at a restaurant downtown and contributed a modest amount to the household budget. "Of course, he knows I work here," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I realized how inadequate they sounded. "I mean, he knows I manage things, handle the business side." Marcus's expression grew more concerned. "But does he know you own it? Does he understand that Bella Vista is your restaurant? That you built this from nothing? Because I've been watching this dynamic for a while now, and I'm starting to wonder if there's a major miscommunication happening in your marriage." The weight of his observations settled over me like a heavy blanket. David knew I worked at Bella Vista, knew I had management responsibilities, knew I sometimes worked late dealing with business issues. But had I ever explicitly told him that I owned the restaurant? Had I ever sat him down and explained that the modest contribution to our household expenses was actually a fraction of what I earned? That I was choosing to maintain our current lifestyle rather than reveal the true scope of my financial independence? Looking back, I realized that our conversations about my work had always been vague, partly because David showed so little interest in the details, and partly because I had been protecting myself from his potential reaction to learning that his wife was more financially successful than he was. David's identity was closely tied to being the provider, the one whose career drive and professional success supported our life together. How would he respond to learning that I had been capable of supporting myself entirely? That I had been choosing to let him maintain his self-image as the primary breadwinner? "It's complicated," I said finally, which was perhaps the most honest thing I had said about my marriage in months. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Emma, I've known you for over a year now, and I've watched you build something incredible here. You're one of the most talented restaurant owners I've ever met, and Bella Vista is proof of that. But I've also watched you diminish yourself whenever David comes up in conversation, as if you're apologizing for your own success." His words stung because they were true. I had been living two separate lives, maintaining a professional identity that I was proud of, while accepting a domestic identity that made me feel small and unimportant. The restaurant industry knew Emma Rodriguez as an owner who had transformed a struggling neighborhood spot into a destination restaurant that drew food critics and locals alike. David knew Emma as his wife who worked in food service and needed rides home from her job. The rain was beginning to ease slightly, but I was already soaked through to the skin. My professional clothes, carefully chosen that morning to project competence and authority during my meetings with suppliers and staff, now clung to me like a costume I was no longer sure I wanted to wear. Standing there in the dim light of the street lamp, I felt the weight of 3 years of careful performance, of allowing David to see only the version of me that fit comfortably into his worldview. "Marcus," I said quietly, "can I ask you something? When you first started your wine bar, did your wife understand what you were building? Did she see it as your career or as a hobby that happened to generate some income?" His face softened with understanding. "Sarah was my business partner from day one. She helped develop our concept, contributed financially to the startup costs, and still works with me on marketing and special events. But Emma, that's not the situation for everyone. Some couples have very different levels of involvement in each other's careers. But did she respect what you were doing?" I pressed. "Even before you were successful, Did she see your work as legitimate and important? Marcus was quiet for a moment, clearly understanding the deeper implications of my questions. Yes, he said finally. Even when we were struggling to pay rent and wondering if we had made a terrible mistake, Sarah never treated my work as anything less than a serious career endeavor. She might have questioned our financial projections or challenged my marketing strategies, but she never dismissed what I was trying to build. The contrast was stark and painful. David had never shown curiosity about my business strategies, never asked about my financial projections, never engaged with Bella Vista as anything more significant than the place where his wife went to work each day. He had never visited during business hours to see me in my professional environment, never met my staff beyond brief introductions when they happened to be around during pickup times, never asked to see our reviews or discussed our menu development process. I think, I said slowly, working through the realization as I spoke. I think I've been protecting David from the truth about my success because I was afraid it would threaten his sense of himself as the provider in our relationship. Marcus shifted the umbrella to better cover both of us as the wind picked up. And how's that working out for you? The question was gentle but pointed, and it forced me to confront the reality of my situation. I was standing in the rain, waiting for a husband who couldn't be bothered to respond to my messages, feeling like a child waiting to be collected rather than a successful business owner who had just concluded a profitable evening at her own restaurant. The protection I thought I was offering David had come at the cost of my own dignity and self-respect. Not particularly well, I admitted. We stood in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching the rain create rivulets that carried the day's debris toward the storm drains. I found myself thinking about the evening's service, about the satisfied customers who had complimented our new seasonal menu, about the staff meeting I had led earlier in the week to discuss our expansion plans. At Bella Vista, I was confident, decisive, respected. In my marriage, I had somehow become passive, apologetic, grateful for attention and consideration that should have been freely given. You know what bothers me most? I said suddenly. It's not just that David doesn't understand what I've built here. It's that I've been complicit in keeping him ignorant. I've been so concerned with managing his ego that I've been hiding my own accomplishments. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. That's a heavy burden to carry, and it's not sustainable long term. Eventually, living two different versions of yourself becomes exhausting. He was right, and I was beginning to feel that exhaustion acutely. The mental energy required to constantly downplay my professional success, to frame my work in terms that wouldn't threaten David's self-image, to pretend that his career was more important than mine had been draining me for months. I had been performing the role of the supportive wife so convincingly that I had almost convinced myself it was real. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I felt a surge of relief thinking David had finally responded. Instead, I found a message from my sous chef, Miguel, checking to make sure I had gotten home safely. Miguel had been with Bella Vista since our second month of operation, and he understood the restaurant business well enough to know that owners didn't typically need rides home from their own establishments. He was too diplomatic to comment directly, but his concern was evident. Everything? Good, boss, the message read. Saw you were still here when I left. Hope you made it home okay. The word boss jumped out at me, a reminder of my actual role and responsibilities. Miguel and the rest of my staff saw me as their leader, the person who made final decisions about menu changes, staffing issues, and business strategy. They came to me with problems and looked to me for solutions. They respected my judgment and valued my input on both creative and operational matters. The contrast with David's perception of me was jarring. I showed the message to Marcus, who read it with a slight smile. Your staff cares about you. That's the sign of a good leader. They do care, I agreed, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. We've built something special together at Bella Vista. The team is incredible, and they've been essential to our success. David knows about your staff, about how they relate to you? Marcus asked. I considered the question, trying to remember any conversations David and I had had about my working relationships. He knew I worked with other people, obviously, but he had never shown interest in the dynamics of those relationships or my role in managing them. When I occasionally mentioned staff issues or team achievements, his responses were polite but distant, the way someone might respond to news about acquaintances they had never met. Not really, I said. He knows I work with people, but he's never asked about my relationships with them or my role in managing the team. That's a significant oversight, Marcus observed. Understanding someone's professional relationships tells you a lot about their character and competence. The fact that your staff respects you enough to check on your well-being after hours says something important about the kind of leader you are. The observation hit me hard because it highlighted yet another area where David had shown no curiosity about my life. He had never asked about my management style, never inquired about how I handled difficult staff situations, never wondered about the skills required to keep a restaurant running smoothly. In his mind, restaurant work was presumably straightforward, requiring no particular expertise or leadership ability. Marcus, I said, I think I need to have a serious conversation with David about our marriage and about his understanding of my career. But I'm not sure how to approach it without it feeling like an attack on his ego. Maybe, Marcus suggested gently. The problem isn't that you might hurt his ego. Maybe the problem is that protecting his ego has required you to hide your own accomplishments and accept a diminished role in your own marriage. The truth of his statement was undeniable. I had been so focused on managing David's feelings that I had stopped advocating for my own needs and recognition. I had accepted being seen as less capable, less ambitious, less successful than I actually was, because it seemed easier than challenging David's assumptions about our respective roles. Another 20 minutes passed without any word from David. By this point, it had been over an hour since I had first called him, and his silence was no longer explainable by simple distraction or poor timing. Marcus had long since given up any pretense that this was a normal situation, and his concern was becoming increasingly evident. Emma, this isn't okay, he said finally. Even if David got caught up in something, even if he forgot for a while, it's been over an hour. A caring partner would have responded by now, would have explained what happened, would have arranged alternative transportation for you. I knew he was right, but acknowledging it meant confronting the broader pattern of inconsideration that had been developing in my marriage. David's lateness and unresponsiveness weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a larger dynamic where his time and priorities were treated as more important than mine. He would never have left me waiting if I were his boss or an important client. The fact that he felt comfortable leaving his wife stranded said something significant about how he valued our relationship. I think, I said slowly, I need to call someone else for a ride. This isn't going to resolve itself tonight. Marcus looked relieved. I can drive you home, Emma. Or if you'd prefer to call someone else, at least come sit in my car while you... Wait. You don't need to stand out here like this. I was about to accept his offer when my phone rang. Finally, David was calling. I answered immediately, expecting an explanation and an apology. Emma, hey, sorry I'm running late. David's voice came through the speaker, slightly slurred and with background noise that sounded like a bar or restaurant. I'm still at Murphy's with the guys. Lost track of time. Can you just grab an Uber home? I'll reimburse you. The casual tone of his voice, as if leaving me waiting for over an hour was a minor inconvenience rather than a serious inconsideration, sparked something in me that I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't just anger, it was clarity. David wasn't calling to apologize or to rush over to pick me up. He was calling to tell me to handle the situation myself so he could continue his evening without interruption. David, I said, working to keep my voice level, I've been waiting outside in the rain for over an hour. I called and texted multiple times. Where exactly have you been? I told you, I'm at Murphy's. We got to talking about the Morrison account. And you know how these things go. It's networking, Emma. It's important for my career. The dismissive tone was unmistakable. His networking was important. My being stranded was an inconvenience to be solved with a rideshare app and a promise of reimbursement. The contrast between how he treated his professional obligations and his personal responsibilities was stark and insulting. So you saw my messages and chose not to respond? I asked. I didn't want to interrupt the conversation to have a whole text exchange, he said, his tone growing slightly defensive. Look, I said I'd reimburse you for the Uber. It's not a big deal. Marcus was standing close enough to hear David's side of the conversation, and his expression reflected the same disbelief I was feeling. David was treating my transportation needs as if they were an optional service he could choose to provide or not, rather than a commitment he had made to his wife. It is a big deal to me, I said firmly. I've been standing outside my workplace for over an hour in the rain, worried something had happened to you. The least you could have done was respond to my messages to let me know you weren't coming. Jesus, Emma, why are you making such a drama out of this? Just get an Uber and we'll talk when I get home. The line went dead. David had hung up on me rather than continue a conversation about his inconsiderate behavior. Standing there with the phone in my hand, listening to the dial tone, I felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of my marriage. This wasn't about poor time management or getting caught up with friends. This was about David's basic lack of respect for me as a person whose time and comfort mattered. Marcus had heard enough of the conversation to understand what had happened. Emma, I'm sorry. That was unacceptable. I looked at my phone, at the missed calls and unanswered texts, at the evidence of over an hour of attempted communication that David had ignored because he didn't want to interrupt his social evening. Then I looked up at Marcus, this man who had taken time out of his own evening to make sure I was safe, who had stood with me in the rain offering practical help and emotional support. You know what? I said, feeling a surge of anger and determination. I think it's time David learned some things about his wife that he's been too disinterested to discover on his own. Marcus raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I said, pulling my keys out of my purse and looking back at Bella Vista. I think it's time for David to meet the real Emma Rodriguez. Not the woman who works at a restaurant, but the woman who owns one. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving the street gleaming under the streetlights. As I stood there looking at my restaurant, at the business I had built through years of hard work and careful planning, I realized that I was tired of hiding my success to protect someone else's ego. I was tired of being seen as less than I was, tired of accepting treatment that I would never tolerate in any other relationship. Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen from him all evening. I think that's an excellent idea, and I think David is in for quite a surprise. As we walked back toward Bella Vista, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Excitement about the prospect of finally being seen for who I really was. Tomorrow, I decided, would be the day David learned that his wife wasn't just someone who worked at a restaurant. She was someone who owned one, and that difference was about to change everything between them. The next morning arrived with the kind of brilliant sunshine that makes yesterday's storm feel like a distant memory. But the clarity that had come to me while standing in the rain remained sharp and undeniable. David had stumbled home around 2 a.m, reeking of beer and expensive whiskey, muttering something about the Morrison account before collapsing into bed without so much as acknowledging that he had left me stranded for hours. I had pretended to be asleep, not trusting myself to have a rational conversation while my anger was still so fresh and raw. By the time David's alarm went off at 7:30, I was already dressed and ready to leave for what he assumed was my morning shift at Bella Vista. He emerged from the bathroom looking remarkably put together for someone who had consumed enough alcohol to pickle a small animal, his hair perfectly styled and his shirt crisp despite his late-night adventures. This was David's particular talent, the ability to compartmentalize his personal life so completely that his professional persona never seemed to suffer from his evening indulgences. "Morning, babe," he said, barely glancing up from his phone, as he scrolled through what I assumed were work emails. "Sorry about last night. You know how these client dinners can go. Did you make it home okay?" The casual tone, as if he were asking about the weather rather than acknowledging that he had abandoned his wife in a rainstorm, confirmed everything I had realized during my conversation with Marcus. David genuinely didn't understand the severity of his behavior because he had never been forced to confront the consequences of treating me as an afterthought in my own life. "I managed," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Marcus Chen gave me a ride home." David looked up from his phone with a slight frown, as if trying to place the name. "Marcus Chen? Who's that?" "He owns Vintage Wine Bar on Morrison Street. We're friends." I watched his face carefully as I provided this information, curious to see if he would make any connection between my friendship with another restaurant owner and the true nature of my own work. "Oh, right. Restaurant people," David said dismissively, his attention already drifting back to his phone. "That's nice that your co-workers look out for each other." The mischaracterization was so profound that for a moment, I was speechless. Marcus wasn't my co-worker. He was my peer, a fellow business owner who had succeeded in the same industry where I had built my own empire. But in David's mental framework, anyone associated with the restaurant business was automatically categorized as service industry personnel, regardless of their actual role or level of success. "David," I said carefully, testing the waters, "what exactly do you think I do at Bella Vista?" He looked up again, this time with genuine confusion, as if the question itself was strange. "You work there. You're like a manager or something, right? You handle the business stuff while other people cook and serve." He shrugged, clearly feeling that this level of detail was more than sufficient. "Why? Did something happen at work yesterday?" The breadth of his ignorance was staggering. After 3 years of marriage and countless conversations about my daily activities, David had somehow managed to avoid learning even the most basic facts about my professional life. He knew I went to Bella Vista most days, knew I sometimes worked late, knew I occasionally dealt with what he termed restaurant drama, but he had never bothered to understand my actual role or responsibilities. "No, nothing happened," I said, though we both knew that was far from true. "I was just curious about your perception of my work." David's phone buzzed with what appeared to be an urgent message, and I watched his focus shift entirely away from our conversation. This was another pattern I had learned to recognize. Whenever our discussions ventured into territory that might require him to demonstrate genuine interest in my life, some work crisis would conveniently arise to redirect his attention. "Shit. The Morrison meeting got moved up to 9, he said, already reaching for his suit jacket. "I need to get going. Can you handle dinner tonight? Maybe order something in? I might be late again if this goes well." And just like that, he was gone, leaving behind only the scent of his expensive cologne and the implicit assumption that my evening would be organized around his unpredictable schedule. I stood in our kitchen, surrounded by the high-end appliances and designer fixtures that David's salary had purchased, feeling like a stranger in my own life. The irony of his request that I handle dinner wasn't lost on me. David was asking the owner of one of Portland's most respected restaurants to order takeout because he might be too busy to eat at home. If he had the slightest understanding of my actual expertise, he might have requested that I cook something special, might have expressed interest in the culinary skills that had helped make Bella Vista a destination for food lovers throughout the Pacific Northwest. I finished my coffee in contemplative silence, using the quiet morning hours to plan what needed to be a very careful strategy. Marcus had been right the night before when he suggested that David's ignorance about my career wasn't entirely accidental. I had been complicit in maintaining his delusions, allowing him to see only the version of me that fit comfortably into his worldview. But protecting David from the truth about my success had come at an enormous cost to my own sense of self-worth and authenticity. The drive to Bella Vista took me through the heart of Portland's Pearl District, past the galleries and boutiques that had transformed this former industrial area into one of the city's most desirable neighborhoods. I had chosen this location for the restaurant precisely because of its evolution, the way it represented transformation and growth while maintaining connections to its working-class roots. The parallels to my own situation weren't lost on me as I navigated the familiar streets. Bella Vista occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse, its large windows and exposed brick creating an atmosphere that was both sophisticated and welcoming. The morning sun streaming through those windows illuminated the dining room where I had hosted food critics, celebrated milestone birthdays, and watched first dates turn into proposals. This space represented 3 years of my creative vision, financial risk, and relentless hard work. Yet David had never once asked to see it during business hours or expressed curiosity about the environment where I spent most of my waking hours. Miguel was already in the kitchen when I arrived, working through prep for the lunch service with the focused intensity that had made him such a valuable team member. He looked up as I entered, his expression shifting to concern as he remembered the previous evening's situation. "Boss, everything okay? You looked pretty stranded last night when I left." I appreciated his directness, the way he could express concern without prying into personal details that weren't his business. This was the quality that had made Miguel not just an excellent sous chef, but a trusted colleague whose judgment I valued on both culinary and operational matters. "I'm fine, Miguel. Just some transportation issues that got worked out." I paused, considering how much to share about the larger situation brewing in my personal life. "Actually, I might need to ask the team for some flexibility over the next few days. There are some personal matters I need to address that might affect my schedule." Miguel nodded, his expression understanding. "Whatever you need, boss. You know the team has your back. We can handle things here if you need to deal with family stuff." The loyalty and competence of my staff was something I never took for granted. Building a team that could operate smoothly in my absence had been one of my key priorities from the beginning, but it had also been essential given David's complete lack of understanding about the demands of restaurant ownership. He expected me to be available for his social events and personal needs without any recognition that I had responsibilities and obligations that extended far beyond his convenience. "I appreciate that, Miguel, and I want you to know that whatever happens over the next few days, it won't affect the restaurant or anyone's job security. This is about some misconceptions that need to be cleared up, not about any problems with the business." He studied my face with the perceptiveness that came from working closely together for nearly 2 years. "Misconceptions about what?" "About what I do here," I said simply. "About who I am professionally." Understanding dawned in Miguel's expression, and I realized that my staff had probably wondered about the disconnect between my authority at Bella Vista and David's obvious ignorance about my role. They had been too professional to comment directly, but they had undoubtedly noticed that my husband treated me like someone who worked in food service rather than someone who owned a successful restaurant. "Ah," Miguel said quietly. "I wondered about that. The way he acts when he picks you up, it's like he thinks you're just another employee here." The confirmation that my staff had observed David's dismissive attitude was both embarrassing and validating. It meant that my perception of his behavior wasn't distorted by personal sensitivity. It was obvious enough that other people had noticed and found it puzzling. "That's exactly the problem," I admitted, "and it's something I should have addressed a long time ago." The morning passed quickly as I threw myself into the familiar rhythms of restaurant management. There were vendor deliveries to approve, staff schedules to finalize, and menu adjustments to discuss with Miguel based on seasonal ingredient availability. This work was both complex and rewarding, requiring the kind of multitasking and decision-making, skills that David would never have imagined I possessed. Around 11, I received a text from Sarah Martinez, the food critic for Portland Monthly, who had been instrumental in establishing Bella Vista's reputation when she gave us a glowing review 6 months after we opened. Sarah had become a friend. Over the years, someone who understood both the business side of restaurants and the creative passion that drove people like me to succeed in such a challenging industry. Emma, I'm working on a piece about women entrepreneurs in Portland's food scene. Would you be available for an interview this week? I'd love to feature Bella Vista and discuss your journey as a restaurant owner. The timing of her request felt like a sign from the universe. Here was an opportunity to have my professional accomplishments recognized and documented, to be featured as the successful business owner I actually was, rather than the vague restaurant worker that David assumed me to be. More importantly, it was a chance to create a public record of my true role that would be impossible for David to ignore or dismiss. I responded immediately, confirming my availability and suggesting that we conduct the interview at Bella Vista during the dinner service, so Sarah could observe the restaurant in full operation. This would provide the most authentic representation of my role and responsibilities, showing me in my natural environment as I managed the complex orchestration of a busy evening service. As I was finalizing the details with Sarah, Marcus texted to check on how I was doing after the previous night's events. His concern was touching and provided a stark contrast to David's casual dismissal of the entire situation. Feeling better today? Last night was rough, but I hope you're able to move forward with whatever you're planning. I appreciated that. Marcus didn't push for details about my intentions, trusting that I would handle the situation in whatever way felt most appropriate. This kind of respectful support was something I had learned to value highly, especially when contrasted with David's tendency to dismiss my concerns or minimize my experiences. Much better, thank you. Taking some positive steps to address the underlying issues. I'll keep you posted on how things develop. The lunch service was particularly busy, with several tables of business people from the surrounding offices and a group of food bloggers who had heard about our new seasonal menu. I moved through the dining room, checking on tables and coordinating with the service staff, fully in my element as the restaurant's owner and creative director. This was the version of myself that felt most authentic, the confident professional who had built something meaningful and successful. Around 2:30, as the lunch crowd was beginning to thin out, I noticed a familiar figure walking past the restaurant's front windows. It was Jennifer Walsh, one of David's colleagues from his tech company, someone I had met at several work-related social events over the past year. Jennifer had always been polite, but distant during our interactions, treating me with the kind of superficial friendliness that people reserve for spouses they don't expect to have much in common with. On impulse, I walked outside to greet her, curious to test my growing theory about how David's colleagues perceived me based on the information he had shared about my career. Jennifer, hi. What brings you to this part of town? She looked genuinely surprised to see me, glancing up at the Bella Vista sign with obvious confusion. Emma, wow, I didn't expect to run into you here. Are you working lunch shifts now too? The question confirmed everything I had suspected about David's representation of my professional life. Jennifer clearly believed that I was an hourly employee who worked various shifts at the restaurant, not someone who would be present during business hours as a matter of ownership and management responsibility. Something like that? I said, choosing not to correct her misunderstanding immediately. How do you know this area? Are you meeting someone for lunch? I had a client meeting at the design firm down the street, Jennifer explained, gesturing toward a building 2 blocks away. I've heard good things about this place, actually. Some of our clients have mentioned it as one of the better restaurants in the Pearl District. Pretty impressive for a neighborhood spot. The irony was perfect. Jennifer was praising my restaurant without realizing that she was talking to its owner, based on her assumption that I was simply an employee who happened to work there. This was exactly the kind of situation that had been occurring throughout my marriage, with David's professional circle forming opinions about Bella Vista while remaining completely ignorant of my connection to its success. "Yes, it's a wonderful restaurant," I agreed. "The owner has built something really special here. Great food, excellent service, strong community connections." Jennifer nodded enthusiastically. "That's what I've heard. David mentioned that you work here, and I've been meaning to try it. Maybe I'll bring my husband sometime when we want to celebrate something special." The casual way she referenced David's description of my work confirmed that he had indeed been categorizing me as restaurant staff rather than ownership. This wasn't a misunderstanding or miscommunication. It was a deliberate misrepresentation of my professional status that David was spreading throughout his social and professional circles. "I think you would really enjoy the experience," I said, carefully. "The owner takes great pride in creating memorable evenings for guests, especially those celebrating special occasions." We chatted for a few more minutes about general neighborhood topics before Jennifer continued on her way, leaving me standing outside my own restaurant with a profound sense of clarity about the scope of David's misconceptions and their impact on how his entire social circle perceived me. This wasn't just about his personal disrespect for my career. It was about the public identity he had created for me that bore no resemblance to my actual accomplishments. Back inside Bella Vista, I found myself looking at the restaurant with fresh eyes, seeing it as David's colleagues would if they ever bothered to research the ownership or read reviews that mentioned my name and role. The disconnect between their expectations of a neighborhood spot where David's wife works and the reality of an award-winning restaurant owned by a successful entrepreneur was jarring enough to be almost comical. The afternoon brought a steady stream of tasks that required the kind of high-level decision-making that David would never have imagined me capable of. There were negotiations with a potential new wine distributor, discussions with my accountant about tax strategies for the upcoming year, and a conference call with the restaurant designer about plans for expanding our private dining area. Each interaction required expertise, authority, and business acumen that extended far beyond David's conception of restaurant work. As I was reviewing quarterly financial reports that showed Bella Vista's continued growth and profitability, my phone rang with David's name on the caller ID. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, not feeling prepared for another conversation that would require me to pretend his behavior the night before had been acceptable. But curiosity about what he might want in the middle of his workday won out. "Hi, David. What's up?" "Hey, babe. Quick question. Some of the guys want to check out that new steakhouse downtown tonight. Would you mind if I joined them instead of coming home for dinner? I know you said you'd handle food anyway, so it shouldn't be a problem." The casual assumption that my evening plans were infinitely flexible while his social opportunities took priority was so characteristic that I felt a familiar surge of resentment. David was essentially asking permission to abandon our dinner plans while simultaneously making it clear that he expected me to be grateful for the advance notice. "Actually, David, I have plans tonight too. I'm conducting a business meeting that will probably run late." There was a pause on the other end of the line, as if he was processing this unexpected information. "A business meeting? At the restaurant? Is everything okay? Are you in trouble with your manager or something?" The questions revealed so much about David's assumptions that I felt a moment of genuine pity for him. In his mind, the only reason I would have a business meeting would be if I were facing some kind of disciplinary action or employment problem. The possibility that I might be conducting business as an owner or decision maker had never occurred to him. "Everything's fine, David. It's actually a very positive meeting about the restaurant's growth and success. But it means I'll be working late, so your steakhouse plan works out well for both of us." "Oh, okay, good. I mean, good that you're not in trouble. And good that the timing works out." He paused again, and I could practically hear him trying to formulate a question about my mysterious business meeting without appearing too interested in the details of my work life. "What kind of growth meeting? Like, are they promoting you? Or something?" The question was so absurdly off base that I had to bite back laughter. David was trying to understand my professional development through the lens of traditional employment, where advancement meant moving up someone else's corporate ladder rather than building your own business empire. Something like that, I said, deciding that this wasn't the moment for full disclosure. I'll tell you all about it when I get home tonight. Enjoy your steakhouse dinner. After ending the call, I sat in my office looking at the financial reports, spread across my desk, marveling at how completely David had managed to miss the reality of my professional life. The numbers told a story of consistent growth, strategic expansion, and financial success that would have impressed any business professional. Yet my own husband remained convinced that I was some kind of mid-level restaurant employee whose biggest career aspiration might be a promotion to assistant manager. The afternoon continued with a series of interactions that highlighted the gulf between my actual professional responsibilities and David's perception of my work. There was a call from a food and wine magazine requesting an interview about my innovative approach to seasonal menu planning, an email from the Portland Restaurant Association inviting me to speak at their upcoming conference on women in hospitality, leadership, and a visit from a local politician who wanted to discuss my participation in a small business advocacy initiative. Each of these conversations treated me as the serious business professional I was, someone whose opinions carried weight in the local food scene and whose success was recognized and respected by peers and industry leaders. The contrast with David's casual dismissal of my career was becoming more stark and painful with each passing hour. Around 4 o'clock, I received an unexpected visit from Tom Bradley, the owner of the building that housed Bella Vista. Tom was a savvy real estate investor who had been instrumental in the Pearl District's transformation, and our relationship had evolved from landlord-tenant to mutual respect between successful business people. "Emma, good to see you. Do you have a few minutes to discuss the lease renewal?" I welcomed him into my office, grateful for another reminder of my legitimate place in Portland's business community. Tom had always treated me as an equal, someone whose success enhanced the value of his property and whose business acumen he respected. "Of course. I've been meaning to schedule that conversation. The current lease has been working well for both of us." "Absolutely. Your restaurant has been a tremendous asset to the building and the neighborhood. Property values in this area have increased significantly since Bella Vista opened, and I get calls regularly from people wanting to know about other available spaces in the building." Tom's recognition of my business impact was exactly the kind of professional respect that David had never shown. Tom understood that my success had broader implications, that Bella Vista's reputation and customer draw affected the entire commercial district in positive ways. "I'm glad the relationship has been mutually beneficial," I said. "I'd like to discuss expanding our space if you have any adjacent units coming available. We're ready to add a private event space that would allow us to serve larger groups." "I was hoping you'd say that. The unit next door is becoming available in 6 months, and I'd much rather lease it to an established tenant with a proven track record than deal with new tenants who might not understand the neighborhood's character." We spent the next hour discussing expansion plans, lease terms, and the logistics of combining the two spaces. It was exactly the kind of strategic business conversation that required long-term vision, financial planning, and operational expertise. As we shook hands on the preliminary agreement, Tom made a comment that stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. "You know, Emma, it's refreshing to work with someone who really understands both the creative and business sides of restaurant ownership. A lot of people think they can succeed in this industry based on passion alone, but you've always understood that sustainable success requires solid business fundamentals." The compliment was particularly meaningful because it came from someone who had observed my professional development over 3 years and had seen me navigate both challenges and opportunities with increasing confidence and skill. Tom's respect for my business acumen stood in sharp contrast to David's complete ignorance of my professional capabilities. As the dinner service approached, I found myself feeling excited about Sarah's interview in a way that went beyond simple, professional recognition. This was an opportunity to create a documented record of my actual achievements. to have my story told accurately by someone who understood the restaurant industry and could appreciate the scope of what I had built. Miguel and the evening staff were already in full preparation mode when Sarah arrived at 5:30, dressed professionally, but casually enough to blend into the restaurant environment during service. I had worked with food writers before and appreciated Sarah's approach of observing first and asking questions between the natural breaks in service. "Emma, the space looks fantastic. I can see why this has become such a destination spot." Sarah looked around the dining room with the trained eye of someone who had evaluated hundreds of restaurants. "Walk me through tonight's service. I want to understand your role in the operation." What followed was one of the most professionally satisfying evenings I had experienced in months. Sarah observed as I coordinated with the kitchen on timing for a large party, consulted with our sommelier on wine pairings for an anniversary celebration, and handled a minor crisis when a delivery of specialty ingredients arrived later than expected. She watched me interact with staff, make real-time decisions about service flow, and personally visit tables to ensure that guests were having exceptional experiences. Throughout the evening, Sarah asked thoughtful questions about my background, my vision for Bella Vista, and my approach to building a successful restaurant in Portland's competitive market. These were the kinds of conversations I had been craving, discussions that recognized my expertise and treated my professional accomplishments as worthy of serious attention. "Your staff clearly respects you," Sarah observed during a brief lull between courses. "That's not always easy to achieve in this industry. What's your management philosophy?" "I believe in hiring excellent people and then trusting them to do their jobs," I explained. "But I also believe in being present and engaged, in understanding every aspect of the operation so I can support my team when they need backup or guidance." "And how do you balance the creative side with the business side?" A lot of restaurant owners struggle with that dual focus. The question allowed me to discuss the strategic thinking behind menu development, the financial planning required for seasonal transitions, and the marketing strategies that had helped build Bella Vista's reputation. These were topics I never got to explore with David, who showed no interest in the intellectual challenges of restaurant ownership. As the evening progressed, I became increasingly aware of how energizing it was to be seen and appreciated for my actual capabilities. Sarah's questions demonstrated genuine respect for my expertise, and her observations about the restaurant's operation showed that she understood the complexity of what I managed on a daily basis. Around 9:30, as the dinner service was winding down, my phone buzzed with a text from David. "Steakhouse was great. Probably going to grab drinks after. Don't wait up." The casual dismissal of my evening, combined with his assumption that I would be sitting at home waiting for his return, provided a perfect contrast to the professional recognition I had been experiencing throughout Sarah's interview. David had no idea that while he was enjoying expensive cocktails with his colleagues, his wife was being interviewed as a successful entrepreneur whose business accomplishments were worthy of publication in a major magazine. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked, noticing my momentary distraction. "Just my husband letting me know his evening plans," I said, putting the phone away. "He doesn't really understand the restaurant business, so he tends to assume my work schedule is more predictable than it actually is." Sarah raised an eyebrow, her journalist instincts clearly picking up on the undercurrent of tension in my comment. "That must be challenging, having a partner who doesn't understand your professional life." "It's more challenging than I realized. Until recently," I admitted. "But that's probably a conversation for another time." We concluded the interview around 10 o'clock, after Sarah had observed the end-of-service breakdown and cleanup that demonstrated the scope of operational management required to run a restaurant successfully. Her questions had covered everything from my culinary training to my business education to my future plans for expansion and growth. "This has been fantastic, Emma. I have everything I need for a really compelling profile. You should be proud of what you've built here." As I walked Sarah to the door, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with positive press coverage and everything to do with being truly seen and appreciated for my professional accomplishments. This was what respectful recognition felt like, and the contrast with David's dismissive attitude was more stark than ever. The restaurant was quiet now, with only the soft sounds of the final cleanup echoing from the kitchen. I stood in the empty dining room, looking at the space I had created and thinking about the conversation I would need to have with David about the fundamental dishonesty that had crept into our marriage. Tomorrow, I decided, would be the day he learned exactly who he had married. The morning of reckoning arrived with unusual clarity, both in the weather and in my own mind. David had returned home well after midnight, stumbling through our apartment, with the practiced stealth of someone who had perfected the art of late-night arrivals. I had been awake, lying in the darkness and planning exactly how this conversation would unfold, but I maintained the pretense of sleep to avoid a discussion, while he was intoxicated and I was emotionally charged. When his alarm buzzed at the usual time, David went through his morning routine with mechanical precision, seemingly unaware that anything had fundamentally shifted in our relationship. He hummed softly while shaving, scrolled through his phone, during coffee, and prepared for another day at the office with the same casual confidence he brought to every aspect of his life. The disconnect between his oblivious contentment and my growing resolve to shatter his comfortable illusions was almost surreal. "Big day today," he announced while adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror. "The Morrison deal is moving to final negotiations, and if everything goes well, we're looking at a significant commission bonus by the end of the quarter." I watched him from the kitchen doorway, noting how easily he shared details about his professional challenges and victories, how naturally he assumed I would be interested in his career developments. The contrast with his complete indifference to my own work life was so pronounced that I wondered how I had tolerated it for so long. "That sounds promising," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Speaking of work developments, I have some interesting news to share with you tonight." David paused in his tie adjusting, glancing at me with mild curiosity. "Good news or bad news? Did your manager finally give you that promotion you were hoping for?" The question revealed the depths of his misunderstanding so completely that I felt a moment of genuine sympathy for him. David was about to have his entire perception of reality challenged, and he had no idea what was coming. In his mind, the most significant career development I could possibly experience would be advancing within someone else's organizational structure. "Definitely good news," I said carefully. "But it's the kind of conversation that deserves proper attention, so let's plan to talk when you get home tonight." "Sure thing. I should be home by 7 unless the negotiations run really late." David grabbed his briefcase and headed toward the door, then paused and turned back. "Oh, and thanks for being flexible about dinner last night. The guys really appreciated having me there for the team celebration." The casual gratitude, as if my flexibility were a given rather than a choice I made to accommodate his priorities, reinforced everything I had been thinking about the fundamental imbalance in our relationship. David operated from an assumption that his time was inherently more valuable than mine, that his social and professional obligations naturally took precedence over any plans or needs I might have. After he left, I spent the morning at Bella Vista, handling the administrative tasks that kept the restaurant running smoothly, but were invisible to anyone who didn't understand the complexity of restaurant ownership. There were payroll approvals, vendor negotiations, health department documentation, and strategic planning for the upcoming holiday season. Each task required decision-making authority and business expertise that David would never have credited me with possessing. Around 10 o'clock, I received a call from Rachel Torres, the event coordinator at the Portland Convention Center. Rachel had been trying to book Bella Vista for catering services for several high-profile events, and our conversation provided another stark reminder of my professional reputation in the local business community. "Emma, I'm so glad I caught you. We have a corporate client requesting specifically for Bella Vista to cater their annual gala next month. They mentioned your restaurant by name and said they were willing to work around your schedule to make it happen. The request was both flattering and significant, representing the kind of recognition that came from years of building a strong reputation for quality and reliability. Corporate clients didn't seek out specific caterers based on casual recommendations. They researched track records and demanded excellence that could enhance their own professional image. That's wonderful to hear, Rachel. Tell me more about the event and their specific needs. We spent 20 minutes discussing menu options, service requirements, and logistical details that would need to be coordinated between Bella Vista and the convention center staff. The conversation required the kind of strategic thinking and operational expertise that David had never witnessed me demonstrate, skills he had no idea I possessed. I have to say, Emma, you've built something really special with Bella Vista. Our corporate clients are becoming increasingly sophisticated about their catering choices, and your restaurant consistently gets mentioned as the gold standard for quality and professionalism. The compliment was particularly meaningful coming from someone who worked with dozens of catering operations throughout the year and could make informed comparisons about quality and service levels. Rachel's recognition of Bella Vista's reputation highlighted the professional respect I had earned in Portland's business community, respect that David had never acknowledged or perhaps even realized existed. After confirming the catering details, I found myself thinking about how to present tonight's revelation to David in a way that would be impossible for him to dismiss or minimize. The challenge wasn't just correcting his misunderstanding about my job title. It was helping him recognize that his entire framework for understanding our relationship had been fundamentally flawed. The solution came to me while I was reviewing the restaurant's latest financial statements. Instead of simply telling David about my role as owner, I would show him the documentation that proved it. Bank statements, tax returns, business licenses, vendor contracts, employee records, all the paperwork that constituted the legal and financial reality of Bella Vista's ownership structure. This wouldn't be a conversation he could dismiss as exaggeration or misunderstanding. It would be an undeniable presentation of facts. I spent the lunch hour gathering documents from my office files, creating a comprehensive portfolio that told the story of Bella Vista's development from initial concept to successful operation. There were incorporation papers showing me as the sole proprietor, loan documents with my signature as the responsible party, insurance policies listing me as the named insured, and lease agreements bearing my name as the tenant. Any one of these documents would have been sufficient to prove my ownership, but together they created an irrefutable case that even David wouldn't be able to rationalize away. The afternoon brought another reminder of my professional standing when Dr. Amanda Chen, a prominent local physician and longtime Bella Vista customer, stopped by to discuss hosting her daughter's graduation celebration at the restaurant. Dr. Chen was exactly the kind of accomplished professional woman that David claimed to respect in his work environment, someone whose opinion he would value if he encountered her in his own social circles. Emma, I can't tell you how much we appreciate everything you've done to make Bella Vista such a special place. My family has celebrated so many important milestones here, and you always make sure everything is perfect. Dr. Chen's recognition of my personal involvement in creating memorable experiences for her family highlighted another aspect of restaurant ownership that David had never considered. This wasn't just about managing a business. It was about understanding that people's special occasions deserved careful attention and genuine care. It's always a pleasure working with your family, Dr. Chen. Milestone celebrations are exactly why I opened Bella Vista, to create a space where important moments could be honored properly. We discussed menu preferences, timing, and special arrangements for her daughter's party, with Dr. Chen treating me as the authority on all decisions related to the event. Her respect for my expertise and her confidence in my ability to execute, her vision perfectly demonstrated the professional credibility I had built through years of consistent excellence. As Dr. Chen was leaving, she made a comment that would prove prophetic within a few hours. You know, Emma, I often tell people that Bella Vista succeeds because you understand that hospitality is both an art and a business. Not everyone can balance those demands, but you've mastered both sides beautifully. The observation about balancing artistic vision with business acumen was precisely the kind of sophisticated understanding of my professional capabilities that David had never demonstrated. Dr. Chen recognized that successful restaurant ownership required skills that extended far beyond the service industry stereotypes that seemed to define David's perception of my work. The rest of the afternoon passed quickly as I prepared for what I knew would be a life-changing conversation with my husband. I arranged for Miguel to handle the evening service, explaining that I had important personal business to attend to, but would be available by phone if any serious issues arose. Miguel's easy acceptance of this arrangement was another reminder of the trust and respect I had earned from my staff, people who understood my competence and relied on my leadership. Around 5 o'clock, I drove home with the portfolio of documents on the passenger seat, feeling a mixture of nervous anticipation and grim determination. This conversation had been years in the making, and while I couldn't predict David's exact reaction, I was certain that our relationship would never be the same after tonight. The only question was whether the truth would bring us closer together or drive us irreparably apart. David arrived home precisely at 7, looking pleased with himself and eager to share news about his successful day at the office. He found me in the living room with the documents arranged on the coffee table, though I had positioned them so their significance wasn't immediately obvious. "Great day, babe. The Morrison deal is looking really solid, and my manager hinted that this could lead to some serious advancement opportunities if I keep performing at this level." David loosened his tie and settled into his favorite chair, radiating the satisfaction that came from professional recognition and financial success. "So, what's your big news? Did you finally get that promotion?" The moment had arrived, and I felt a strange calm settle over me as I prepared to dismantle David's comfortable assumptions about our life together. "Actually, David, my news is a bit different than what you're expecting. I need to share some information about my work that I should have clarified a long time ago." David's expression shifted to mild concern, as if he were bracing for news. "About workplace conflict or employment problems. Everything okay at the restaurant? Are they having financial troubles? Because if you need to look for a new job, we can handle that. My income is solid enough to carry us through a transition period." The patronizing assumption that any workplace issue I might face would automatically require his financial support was so characteristic that I almost smiled. David's first instinct was to position himself as my economic safety net, the stable provider who could rescue me from the uncertainties of service industry employment. "The restaurant is doing very well financially," I said carefully. "In fact, that's part of what I need to discuss with you. David, I need you to really listen to what I'm about to tell you, because it's going to change your understanding of some fundamental things about our marriage." Now David looked genuinely worried, his mind probably jumping to scenarios involving infidelity or serious personal problems. "Emma, you're starting to scare me. What's going on?" I reached for the first document on the coffee table, the original business license for Bella Vista, and handed it to him. "David, I need you to read this carefully and tell me what it says." He accepted the document with obvious confusion, scanning the official text with the kind of careful attention he brought to important contracts in his own work. I watched his expression change as he processed the information, confusion giving way to disbelief and then to something approaching shock. "This says you're the owner of Bella Vista," he said slowly, looking up at me as if I had just spoken in a foreign language. "But that can't be right. You work there. You're like a manager or something." "Read it again, David. Read my name on the ownership line." He looked down at the document again, his finger tracing the text as if physical contact would somehow change the words. "Emma Rodriguez, sole proprietor of Bella Vista Restaurant." David's voice was flat, processing information that didn't fit into any framework he had previously used to understand our relationship. That's correct. I am the owner of Bella Vista. I have been since the day it opened 3 years ago. I didn't work my way up to this position. I created this position by starting the business myself. David stared at the business license for several long moments, as if hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something that made more sense within his existing worldview. I don't understand. Why didn't you tell me this before? Why did I think you were just an employee? The question revealed the complexity of the situation we had created through years of miscommunication and willful ignorance. David's confusion was genuine. From his perspective, this revelation had come from nowhere, contradicting everything he thought he knew about my professional life. David, I never told you I was an employee. You assumed that, and over time, I stopped correcting your assumptions because they seemed to make you more comfortable with my career. But you never said you owned the place either, David protested, his voice taking on a defensive edge. If you owned a restaurant, that's the kind of thing people mention. That's important information. I reached for another document, a recent profit and loss statement that showed Bella Vista's impressive financial performance. Here's why it's important information, David. This is our revenue and profit for the last quarter. David's eyes widened as he scanned the financial figures, numbers that represented business success on a scale he had never imagined me capable of achieving. The quarterly profit alone exceeded his annual salary, a reality that was clearly causing him to reassess every assumption he had made about our relative financial contributions to the household. These numbers, he said slowly. This can't be right. This says the restaurant made more in 3 months than I make in a year. Those numbers are accurate, and that's just one quarter's results. Bella Vista has been consistently profitable since our second year of operation. I watched David struggle to integrate this information with his existing understanding of our relationship dynamics. In his mental framework, he had been the successful professional while I contributed modestly through service industry work. Learning that I had actually been the higher earner throughout our marriage was clearly causing significant cognitive dissonance. If you're making this kind of money, why are we living like you're bringing in $30,000 a year? Why didn't you ever mention that you were out-earning me by this much? The question struck at the heart of the complicated choices I had made to preserve David's ego and maintain harmony in our marriage. Because I was afraid of how you would react to learning that your wife was more financially successful than you are, I was afraid it would threaten your sense of yourself as the provider in our relationship. David's face cycled through several emotions: confusion, embarrassment, anger, and something that might have been hurt. So you've been lying to me about your income for 3 years? I've been allowing you to make assumptions about my income, I corrected. There's a difference. You never asked for specific financial information, and you never showed enough interest in my work to discover the reality on your own. This was the crux of the issue, and I could see David beginning to realize how his own disinterest in my professional life had contributed to the misunderstanding. He had been content to categorize my work in terms that made sense to him without ever investigating the actual details. But Emma, if you own a restaurant, if you're making this kind of money, why do you need me to pick you up after work? Why are you dependent on me for transportation? The question revealed how completely David had misunderstood the dynamics of our evening routine. I'm not dependent on you for transportation, David. I have my own car. I asked you to pick me up because I thought it was a nice way for us to connect at the end of the workday. A small gesture that showed you cared about my schedule and wanted to spend time together. The distinction was crucial, and I could see David starting to recognize how many of our interactions he had misinterpreted through the lens of his assumptions about my professional and financial status. What I had intended as relationship-building gestures, he had understood as evidence of my dependence on his support. So when I left you stranded the other night, David said slowly, you didn't actually need me to get home. You were just disappointed that I didn't follow through on plans we had made together. Exactly. And when you told me to take an Uber and hung up on me, you weren't solving a practical problem. You were dismissing my feelings and showing me that my time and comfort weren't important enough to interrupt your social evening. I pulled out another set of documents: employee contracts, vendor agreements, and insurance policies that all bore my signature as the person with authority to make binding decisions on behalf of Bella Vista. David, this is what I do all day. I run a business that employs 12 people, serves hundreds of customers each week, and generates revenue that puts us in the top tier of Portland restaurants. I make decisions that affect people's livelihoods, and I'm responsible for the financial and operational success of a complex organization. David examined the contracts with growing amazement, clearly seeing my professional responsibilities in an entirely new light. All this time, I thought you were just taking orders from someone else, following someone else's decisions. I had no idea you were the one making these kinds of choices. And that's exactly the problem. You had no idea because you never asked. You never showed curiosity about my actual role or responsibilities. You were content to assume that my work was simple and unimportant because that fit better with your image of yourself as the serious professional in our relationship. The accusation hung in the air between us, and I could see David struggling with the implications of what I was saying. This wasn't just about his ignorance of my job title. It was about his fundamental lack of interest in my life and experiences. Emma, I never meant to dismiss your work. I just thought... He trailed off, apparently realizing that any explanation would only highlight how superficial his understanding had been. You thought what, David? That restaurant work was inherently less valuable than tech sales? That managing people and running operations was somehow easier than what you do? That my contributions to our household were negligible compared to yours? Each question forced David to confront the assumptions that had shaped his behavior throughout our marriage. I could see him beginning to realize that his casual dismissal of my career hadn't been based on accurate information, but on prejudices about service industry work that he had never bothered to examine. I guess I thought your job was more like a temporary thing, something you were doing while you figured out what you really wanted to do with your career, David admitted. I never understood that you had already figured it out, that this was your career goal all along. The confession revealed how completely David had misunderstood my ambitions and motivations. David, I have a master's degree in business administration. I spent 2 years developing the business plan for Bella Vista, secured financing, found the location, designed the concept, and built the team. This wasn't something I stumbled into. It was something I planned and executed deliberately. David's eyes widened further. You have an MBA? When did you get that? How did I not know about your educational background? The question highlighted another area where David's lack of curiosity about my life had created enormous gaps in his understanding. I got my MBA before we met. It's mentioned on my LinkedIn profile, and it's part of the qualifications that helped me secure business loans for the restaurant. You never asked about my educational background because you assumed it wasn't relevant to the work you thought I was doing. I could see David struggling to reconcile this new information with his long-held beliefs about our respective qualifications and capabilities. Learning that his wife had advanced business education that he had never known about was clearly causing him to question everything he thought he understood about our relationship dynamics. So, when my colleagues meet you at work events, David said slowly, and I introduce you as someone who works at a restaurant, they probably think exactly what Jennifer Walsh thought when I ran into her yesterday. She assumed I was hourly staff working various shifts, not someone who would be present during business hours as a matter of ownership responsibility. David's face flushed with what appeared to be embarrassment. Jennifer mentioned running into you. She said she didn't realize you worked lunch shifts too. I don't work shifts, David. I'm there during lunch because I'm managing the operation, coordinating with staff, meeting with vendors, handling the administrative tasks that keep the business running. Jennifer's confusion was based on the information you had given her about my role. The realization that his misrepresentation of my career had spread throughout his professional network was clearly causing David significant discomfort. Emma, I never meant to misrepresent what you do. I just didn't understand the scope of your responsibilities. But you never tried to understand, David. In 3 years of marriage, you never once asked to visit Bella Vista during business hours to see me in my professional environment. You never requested to meet my staff or learn about my operational challenges. You never expressed curiosity about the skills required to run a successful restaurant. Each statement forced David to confront his own lack of engagement with my professional life. I could see him beginning to realize that his ignorance hadn't been accidental. It had been the result of deliberate choices to remain uninformed about aspects of my life that didn't directly affect him. I thought you were just working there temporarily while you figured out your long-term plans, David said defensively. I didn't want to get too involved if you were just going to move on to something else. The explanation revealed the depth of David's assumptions about my career ambitions and professional competence. David, what gave you the impression that I was working temporarily or that I was uncertain about my career direction? He was quiet for several moments, apparently realizing that his assumptions hadn't been based on anything I had actually said or done. I guess I just thought that someone with your background would eventually want to do something more professional. The word hung in the air like a slap, revealing the fundamental prejudice that had shaped David's entire understanding of my work. In his mind, restaurant ownership wasn't professional, regardless of the business skills, financial success, or industry recognition it involved. More professional than what, David? More professional than running a business that generates six-figure annual profits? More professional than managing employees, developing strategic plans, and building relationships with vendors and customers? More professional than being recognized as a leader in Portland's restaurant community? David's discomfort was increasingly evident as he struggled to defend a position that was clearly indefensible. I didn't mean it that way. I just meant something that used your education more directly. My MBA is used every single day at Bella Vista. Financial planning, marketing strategy, human resources management, operational efficiency, customer service excellence. Everything I learned in business school is applied constantly in running the restaurant. You assumed it wasn't being used because you assumed restaurant work didn't require sophisticated business skills. I pulled out the final set of documents, reviews from food critics, awards from industry organizations, and letters of recommendation from business partners who had worked with Bella Vista on various projects. David, this is what professional recognition looks like in my industry. Bella Vista has been featured in Portland Monthly, received awards from the Oregon Restaurant Association, and been recommended by the Convention and Visitors Bureau as one of the city's premier dining destinations. David read through the accolades with growing amazement, clearly seeing my professional accomplishments in an entirely new light. Emma, this is incredible. Why didn't you ever show me any of this before? Because you never asked. And because I was afraid you would feel threatened by evidence that my career was more successful than you realized. I was protecting your ego at the expense of my own recognition and self-respect. The confession was painful, but necessary. I had been complicit in maintaining David's ignorance, choosing to preserve his comfortable assumptions rather than demanding the respect and recognition I deserved. So, when you said you had a business meeting last night, David said slowly, that was about this restaurant, about your role as owner. I was being interviewed by Sarah Martinez from Portland Monthly for a feature article about successful women entrepreneurs in the local food scene. While you were having drinks with your colleagues, I was being recognized as a business leader, whose accomplishments are worthy of publication in a major magazine. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. While David had been dismissing my work as unimportant enough to justify leaving me strand dead, I had been receiving professional recognition that validated my standing in Portland's business community. Emma, David said quietly. I don't know what to say. I've clearly made some terrible assumptions about your work, and I can see how that must have been hurtful and frustrating for you. The apology was a start, but I could see that David was still struggling to fully comprehend the implications of what he had learned. This wasn't just about correcting his understanding of my job title. It was about recognizing that his entire approach to our relationship had been based on false premises about our respective values, capabilities, and contributions. David, the issue isn't just that you misunderstood what I do for work. The issue is that you've been treating me as if my time, my career, and my accomplishments are less important than yours. You've been operating from assumptions about my professional competence that you never bothered to verify, and you've been dismissing my concerns and needs based on those false assumptions. I could see David beginning to understand the broader implications of the evening's revelations. This conversation wasn't just going to require him to adjust his understanding of my career. It was going to force him to reconsider his entire approach to our marriage and his role as my partner. The documents lay scattered across the coffee table between us, irrefutable evidence of a reality that David had somehow managed to ignore for 3 years. As he sat there processing the magnitude of his misunderstanding, I realized that this moment would define the future of our relationship. The question now was whether David would be capable of the fundamental changes in attitude and behavior that would be required to build a marriage based on truth rather than comfortable illusions. The silence stretched between us for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. David sat surrounded by the evidence of my true professional life, documents that painted a picture so different from his assumptions that he seemed paralyzed by the cognitive dissonance. I watched him process not just the facts about my career, but the implications for everything he had believed about our relationship, our financial dynamic, and his own role as what he had assumed was the primary breadwinner. "Emma," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I feel like I don't know you at all." The statement hung heavy in the air, and I realized it worked both ways. The man sitting across from me, struggling to reconcile reality with his long-held misconceptions, was revealing aspects of his character that I had been willfully blind to for years. His capacity for dismissing what didn't fit his worldview, his comfort with making assumptions rather than asking questions, his need to see himself as superior in ways that required me to be diminished. "David, you never tried to know me. Not really. You knew the version of me that was convenient for your self-image, and you never questioned whether that version was accurate or complete." He picked up one of the vendor contracts again, staring at my signature as if it might disappear under scrutiny. "But why, Emma? Why didn't you correct me when I got things wrong? Why did you let me think you were just working there instead of owning the place?" The question forced me to confront my own complicity in the deception, the ways I had enabled his ignorance to preserve what I had mistakenly believed was peace in our marriage. Because every time I tried to share details about my work, you changed the subject or responded with such obvious disinterest that I stopped trying. Because when I mentioned business challenges or successes, you treated them like amusing anecdotes rather than serious professional developments. Because I was afraid that if you knew how successful I was, it would threaten your sense of yourself as the provider. David's face cycled through emotions as he processed this explanation. "So, you've been protecting my ego at the expense of what? Your own recognition? Your sense of accomplishment? At the expense of honesty in our marriage? At the expense of being seen and valued for who I actually am, rather than who you needed me to be?" The weight of this admission settled over both of us. I had sacrificed authenticity for what I had believed was stability, hiding my successes, to avoid challenging David's comfortable assumptions about our respective roles. But in doing so, I had created a marriage built on fundamental dishonesty that was ultimately unsustainable. "Emma, I don't understand how I missed all of this. How did I not notice that you were running a business rather than just working at one? The question revealed the depth of David's self-absorption, his ability to remain oblivious to major aspects of my life while believing himself to be an attentive partner. You missed it because you weren't looking. You never visited Bella Vista during business hours to see how I interacted with staff or customers. You never asked about my daily responsibilities or the decisions I had to make. You never wondered why I sometimes came home energized rather than exhausted, why I received calls at home about business issues, why I had meetings that couldn't be rescheduled. Each example forced David to confront another instance of his willful ignorance. I could see him remembering specific situations where the evidence of my true role had been available if he had bothered to pay attention. "The catering contracts?" he said suddenly. "You mentioned catering events sometimes, and I thought you were just helping with serving or setup, but you were actually managing those contracts as the owner." "Exactly. And when I came home talking about staffing decisions or menu changes, you thought I was gossiping about workplace dynamics rather than describing the operational challenges I faced as the person responsible for those decisions." David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration and overwhelm that I recognized from the early days of our relationship when he was dealing with particularly complex problems at work. "Emma, I feel like such an idiot. All those times I offered to help you look for a better job, or suggested you were settling for less than you deserved. I was completely backwards about everything." The recognition was important, but I needed him to understand that this went beyond simple misunderstanding. "David, this isn't just about getting facts wrong. This is about the fundamental lack of respect you've shown for my time, my career, and my autonomy. Even if I had been an hourly employee at someone else's restaurant, leaving me stranded in the rain because you didn't want to interrupt your social evening would have been unacceptable." His face flushed with shame as he remembered the previous night's events in their new context. "Oh God, you weren't just an employee waiting for a ride home. You were the owner of the restaurant, standing outside your own business in the rain. Because your husband couldn't be bothered to answer his phone. But more importantly, I was your wife, standing in the rain because my husband had decided that his social plans were more important than the commitment he had made to pick me up. My job title doesn't change the basic respect I deserve as your partner." This distinction was crucial, and I could see David beginning to understand that the problem wasn't just his ignorance about my career, but his entire approach to our relationship. He had been treating me as a supporting character in his life story, rather than as an equal partner with my own important role to play. "Emma, I want to fix this. I want to understand how to be better, how to support you properly. But I don't even know where to start." The desire to repair our relationship was encouraging, but I needed to see evidence that David understood the scope of changes that would be required. "David, this isn't something that can be fixed with small adjustments or good intentions. This is about fundamentally changing how you see me, how you value my contributions, and how you prioritize my needs alongside your own." I gathered the documents from the coffee table, organizing them back into the portfolio that represented 3 years of professional accomplishments David had never acknowledged. "I need you to understand that Bella Vista isn't just my job. It's my calling, my creative expression, and my contribution to our community. The people who work for me depend on my leadership, and the customers who choose us for their special occasions trust my commitment to excellence. This work matters in ways that extend far beyond generating income." David nodded slowly, and I could see him trying to integrate this new understanding with his previous dismissal of my career. "I can see that now. The reviews you showed me, the recognition from other business owners, the complexity of what you manage every day. I was completely wrong about the significance of what you do. And I need you to understand that my success isn't a threat to yours. 2 people in a marriage can both be accomplished professionals without it creating competition or insecurity. My achievements don't diminish yours, they complement them." This was perhaps the most important point. and I watched David carefully as he processed it. His identity had been so tied to being the primary earner and the more successful partner that learning about my accomplishments had clearly shaken his sense of self. "You're right," he said finally. "I think I was threatened by the idea that you might be more successful than me, so I convinced myself that your work wasn't as important or challenging as mine. That was unfair and stupid." The admission was a start, but I needed to see concrete changes in behavior rather than just acknowledgement of past mistakes. "David, if we're going to rebuild our marriage on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect, I need to see that you're genuinely interested in my professional life. I need you to visit Bella Vista during service hours, meet my staff, understand what I do all day. I need you to stop introducing me as someone who works at a restaurant and start introducing me as someone who owns one. Of course, I want to learn about everything I've been missing. I want to meet the people you work with and see you in your professional environment. And I need you to understand that my time is as valuable as yours. When we make plans, you need to honor them. When I need support or consideration, you need to provide it. When I have professional obligations, you need to respect them the same way you would want me to respect yours." David's expression grew more serious as he realized the practical implications of treating me as an equal partner. "You're absolutely right. I've been selfish and inconsiderate in ways I didn't even recognize." The conversation continued for another hour as we worked through the specific changes that would be needed to rebuild trust and create a more balanced dynamic in our relationship. David asked thoughtful questions about Bella Vista's operations, my staff, and my plans for future growth. For the first time in years, I felt like he was genuinely interested in understanding my professional life, rather than simply tolerating it. "Emma, there's something I need to ask you, and I'm afraid of the answer," David said as we were wrapping up our discussion. "Are we going to be okay? Can our marriage survive this kind of fundamental dishonesty?" The question I had been dreading forced me to confront the uncertainty that had been growing in my mind throughout our conversation. "I don't know, David. I want us to be okay, but I need to see sustained changes in how you treat me and value our relationship. I need to believe that you can see me as an equal partner rather than as someone whose role is to support your success." "What would those changes look like? What do you need from me to rebuild trust?" I had been thinking about this question throughout our conversation, and my answer came from months of suppressed frustration and unmet needs. "I need you to be genuinely curious about my work, to ask questions and show interest in my daily challenges and successes. I need you to visit Bella Vista regularly, not just for pickup and drop-off, but to understand what I've built there. I need you to introduce me accurately to your colleagues and friends, acknowledging my accomplishments rather than minimizing them." David nodded earnestly, clearly committed to making these changes. "I can do that. I want to do that. And I need you to understand that relationship commitments are non-negotiable. If you say you'll pick me up, you need to follow through. If we make plans together, you need to honor them. If I need your support, you need to provide it willingly rather than treating it as an inconvenience. Absolutely. No more leaving you stranded. No more prioritizing social events over our plans. No more treating your needs as optional." The promises were encouraging, but I knew that real change would require sustained effort over time rather than good intentions expressed. In a moment of crisis, "David, I want to give our marriage another chance, but I need to see consistent evidence that you understand and respect who I really am. If you slip back into old patterns of dismissiveness or neglect, I won't be able to stay." The ultimatum was difficult to voice, but necessary. I had spent too many years accepting less than I deserved to maintain peace in our relationship. Moving forward, I needed to prioritize my own dignity and self-respect alongside my commitment to our marriage. "I understand, Emma, and I promise you won't regret giving me this chance to prove that I can be the partner you deserve. Over the following weeks, David made genuine efforts to understand and support my professional life. He visited Bella Vista during service hours, met my staff, and gained appreciation for the complexity of restaurant operations. He corrected his colleagues' misconceptions about my role and began introducing me as a successful restaurant owner rather than someone who worked in food service. Most importantly, he demonstrated consistent reliability in our personal interactions, following through on commitments and treating my time as valuable as his own. The transformation wasn't immediate or perfect, but it was genuine. David began asking thoughtful questions about my business decisions, celebrating my professional victories, and offering emotional support during challenging periods. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like he saw me as a complete person rather than a simplified version designed to complement his self-image. 3 months after our revelation conversation, Sarah Martinez's article about women entrepreneurs in Portland's food scene was published in Portland Monthly. The feature included a full-page photo of me in Bella Vista's kitchen and a detailed profile of my journey from business school to successful restaurant ownership. David framed the article and hung it prominently in our apartment, finally ready to celebrate my accomplishments publicly. The evening the magazine hit newsstands, David surprised me by organizing a celebration dinner at Bella Vista with both our families and close friends. As I looked around the dining room at the people who had gathered to acknowledge my professional success, I realized that the painful confrontation about David's misconceptions had ultimately led to something I had been craving for years: authentic recognition and respect for who I really was. "Ladies and gentlemen," David said, raising his glass to address our guests, "I want to toast my wife Emma, the brilliant entrepreneur who built this incredible restaurant and who has taught me that true partnership means celebrating each other's successes rather than feeling threatened by them." The toast was simple but meaningful, representing David's evolution from a partner who had minimized my accomplishments to one who celebrated them publicly. As our guests raised their glasses and applauded, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with external validation and everything to do with finally being seen and valued for my authentic self. That night, as we walked home through the Pearl District streets that had become familiar territory during my years of building Bella Vista, David took my hand and spoke quietly about the future he envisioned for us. "Emma, I know I have years of making up to do for how dismissive I was of your career and your accomplishments. But I want you to know that I'm committed to being the kind of partner who supports your dreams rather than diminishing them." Looking back, I realized that being stranded in the rain outside my own restaurant had been exactly the catalyst our marriage needed. Sometimes the most painful moments create opportunities for the most necessary changes. David's shock at learning I was the owner, rather than an employee, had forced both of us to confront fundamental dishonesty in our relationship and rebuild it on a foundation of truth and mutual respect. The marriage we created after that difficult conversation was stronger and more authentic than what we had before, built on genuine understanding rather than comfortable assumptions. And every time David introduced me as Emma Rodriguez, owner of Bella Vista, I felt a deep appreciation for the journey that had brought us from deception to honesty, from dismissal to celebration, from a relationship where I hid my success to one where we could both shine fully. 6 months later, the changes in our relationship had become the new normal rather than conscious efforts. David's transformation from dismissive partner to genuine supporter had proven sustainable, and I found myself trusting his commitment in ways I hadn't been able to during those first tentative weeks of rebuilding. The morning routine that had once involved him hurrying out the door while barely acknowledging my existence had evolved into meaningful conversations about our respective days and genuine interest in each other's professional challenges. "The Morrison account is finally closing today," David announced over breakfast, but instead of launching into a monologue about his own success, he paused and asked, "How did the wine distributor meeting go yesterday? Did you get the pricing you wanted for the holiday menu?" These small but significant changes in how we communicated had accumulated into a fundamentally different marriage. David had learned to ask follow-up questions, to remember details from previous conversations about my work, and to offer relevant insights based on his growing understanding of restaurant operations. More importantly, he had stopped treating my professional life as background noise to his own more important career. "The pricing worked out perfectly," I replied, appreciating his genuine interest. "We'll be able to offer 3 different wine pairing options for the holiday season without significantly impacting our profit margins. Miguel is already excited about the menu combinations we discussed." David smiled with what appeared to be authentic pride in my business acumen. "That's fantastic. I love seeing you work through these strategic decisions. You have such a gift for balancing the creative vision with the practical realities." The compliment reflected how much David's understanding of my work had deepened over the months since our revelation conversation. He no longer saw restaurant ownership as simple food service, but recognized the complex blend of creativity, business strategy, and operational management that made Bella Vista successful. His appreciation for my professional skills had grown as he witnessed them firsthand during his regular visits to the restaurant. These visits had become one of the most positive developments in our renewed relationship. David now came to Bella Vista at least twice a week, sometimes for dinner during service hours, and sometimes just to observe the lunch preparation or meet with me during quieter afternoon periods. Watching him interact with my staff and seeing his growing appreciation for the complexity of our operation had been deeply satisfying. "Boss, your husband's here," Miguel had announced the previous week, but his tone carried warmth and acceptance rather than the polite tolerance that had characterized his earlier interactions with David. The staff had noticed the change in how David treated both me and them, evolving from someone who barely acknowledged their existence to someone who asked thoughtful questions about their roles and showed genuine respect for their expertise. The transformation had been particularly evident during a recent evening when David witnessed me handling a kitchen crisis that could have derailed service for a large private party. An equipment malfunction had threatened to delay our main course preparation, and I had to quickly reorganize the cooking timeline while coordinating with servers to manage guest expectations. David watched me navigate the situation with calm authority, making real-time decisions that kept the evening on track, while maintaining our quality standards. "I had no idea," he said quietly as we drove home that night. "I mean, I knew you managed things, but seeing you actually lead through a crisis like that? Emma, you're incredible under pressure. The way your team looked to you for direction and trusted your decisions completely, it was like watching a conductor with an orchestra." The analogy was more sophisticated than anything David had previously offered about my work, reflecting his growing ability to see restaurant service as a coordinated performance requiring skilled leadership rather than simple task completion. His respect for my professional capabilities had become genuine and consistent rather than forced or temporary. This newfound respect had extended beyond our private interactions to David's professional and social circles. The shift in how he introduced me and discussed my career had been remarkable, transforming me from Emma, who works at a restaurant, to Emma, who owns Bella Vista, one of Portland's most successful independent restaurants. His colleagues had begun treating me with the professional respect typically reserved for fellow entrepreneurs, asking substantive questions about business strategy and industry trends. Jennifer Walsh, who had once assumed I worked various shifts at the restaurant, had become one of our most enthusiastic customers and had recommended Bella Vista to several clients for corporate events. "David never told us you were such a successful business owner," she had said during a recent dinner party. "I feel terrible that we didn't recognize your accomplishments earlier." The comment had prompted an interesting conversation about how easily professional women's achievements could be overlooked or minimized when their partners failed to represent them accurately. David had taken responsibility for his previous misrepresentations without making excuses, and his willingness to acknowledge his mistakes publicly had impressed his colleagues and strengthened their respect for both of us. The financial aspects, of our marriage had also required significant adjustment as David came to terms with the reality of our relative incomes. The revelation that I had been the higher earner throughout our marriage had initially challenged his identity as the primary provider, but he had worked through those feelings with surprising maturity. I realize now that I was so focused on feeling important as the breadwinner that I missed the opportunity to celebrate having a partner who was building something amazing, David had confided during one of our more vulnerable conversations. I was threatened by your success instead of proud of it, and that says something about my own insecurities that I needed to address. This level of self-reflection had been encouraging, suggesting that David's changes went deeper than simply correcting his misconceptions about my job title. He had engaged in genuine introspection about the beliefs and insecurities that had shaped his dismissive behavior, and his commitment to personal growth had been consistent and sustained. The practical implications of our financial reality had led to interesting discussions about our future goals and shared decision-making. David had begun deferring to my judgment on major purchases and investments, recognizing that my business experience provided valuable perspective on financial strategy. We had started making joint decisions about everything from vacation planning to retirement savings, with David treating my input as essential rather than optional. I was thinking about the lake house property your parents mentioned, David, I had said recently. But I want to hear your thoughts on the investment potential and whether the timing makes sense given Bella Vista's expansion plans. These conversations reflected a fundamental shift in how David viewed our partnership. Instead of making decisions based on his income and preferences while treating my contributions as supplementary, he had learned to see us as equal partners whose different areas of expertise strengthened our combined decision-making abilities. The changes in our relationship had also influenced how we spent our leisure time and maintained our social connections. David had become genuinely interested in the Portland restaurant scene, attending industry events with me, and developing friendships with other restaurant owners and food professionals. His social circle had expanded beyond his tech colleagues to include people who shared my professional interests and could appreciate the work I had built at Bella Vista. Marcus invited us to that wine tasting event next weekend, David mentioned, referring to the same Marcus Chen who had helped me through that rainy night months ago. I'd love to go if you're interested. I really enjoy talking with him about the business challenges you both face. The fact that David now sought out opportunities to engage with my professional community represented perhaps the most significant evidence of his transformation. He had moved from seeing my work relationships as irrelevant to his life to actively cultivating connections within my industry and finding genuine value in those relationships. Looking back on the painful evening when I stood stranded in the rain outside my own restaurant, I realized that crisis had been exactly what our marriage needed to survive and thrive. The comfortable deceptions we had maintained for years had been fundamentally unsustainable, and David's shock at learning my true professional identity had created the opportunity for authentic rebuilding that might never have occurred otherwise. The marriage we had now was more honest, more respectful, and more genuinely supportive than what we had before. David's evolution from dismissive partner to proud supporter had been remarkable, and my own growth in demanding the respect I deserved had been equally important. Together, we had created a relationship where both partners could succeed without either feeling threatened or diminished. As I prepared for another evening at Bella Vista, knowing that David would join me later to observe the service and celebrate another successful night with the team we had both come to value, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this point. Sometimes the most painful revelations create the foundation for the most meaningful transformations, and our marriage had become proof that authenticity and mutual respect could triumph over comfortable illusions and convenient deceptions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.